Okay, well, I have that it is 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so I'd like to welcome everybody to the All Hazards Consortium's Women as Leaders in Crisis and Consequence Management. My name is Laura Johnson. I'm the Director of Conferences and Events for the All Hazards Consortium. I also have a small business called Training Outreach, and we do emergency preparedness, consulting, training, and events. I'm a mom of 2 teenagers, and I have a dog. So a lot going on. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we got started in doing this new initiative we just launched through All Hazards Consortium called Resilience Rising. We do a 3-day summit on resiliency every January. And we did a breakout session this past January for women to talk about what obstacles they've had in this field, and some tips and tactics to overcome those barriers to their professional advancement. And I just couldn't believe the amount of chats that we got, the questions that we got in that short 45-minute session. It told us that we were really onto something. So the team and I sat down and we came up with the Resilience Rising initiative. And a few things that are coming out of this initiative is if you would like to find a mentor in this industry, we have a website where you can send in a quick form and we'll line you up with someone that can help you out. Just go to our website at ahcusa.org, click on the initiatives tab, and you'll see Resilience Rising as the first tab. And what's great about this is that we have both women and men that are mentors. We're also always looking for mentees, so feel free to reach out to me and I'll put my email in the chat in just a little bit if that's something that you would like to do. We also started a new LinkedIn group called Advancing Women in Crisis and Consequence Management. Also in a few minutes, I'll put my LinkedIn profile in the chat. And I invite you to link in with me and I'll send you a personal invitation to this group. And the purpose of the group is to provide support, resources, just dialogue among women in this industry. And then we also are designing a bunch of webinars and other training. Of course, we have today's webinar, and this is the first in a series of 3 virtual discussions that we are putting together. Sometime in early June, we haven't set the dates yet, we'll be putting on a webinar in building your career in crisis and consequence management. That's for people who are new to the field, looking for resources, mentors, etc. And then sometime over the summer, we'll do a 90-minute webinar on supporting diversity and inclusion in this field. And that'll also include a little bit about allyship, which means if you're a man in this industry, what's a good way you can recognize women at your job or in the field too. And speaking of that, I know that we actually had a few men who registered for the webinar today. I just want to personally thank you for your interest in this topic. That means a lot to the women in the field to have you here today. So again, the initiative is called Resilience Rising, and it's designed to encourage women not only to enter and grow within crisis and consequence management, but to strive for those leadership roles. So let's go ahead and jump into today's webinar. I'd love to introduce your moderator, Heather Geldart, formerly of Arlington Public Safety and first day on the job as Deputy Director with Cal Recycle. Heather?
Thanks so much, Laura. I appreciate the intro. You stole a lot of my thunder into my
sorry.
Introducing the panelists. No, it's perfect. But I do want to build on what you talked about with our turnout from the virtual summit. Kudos to you and the team. We've had over 220 registrants for this event, and the appetite is there, and we want to continue to not only spotlight the talent that we have present in our sector, but also expand the resource offerings, the mentorships, and the opportunities to really engage with these exceptional women that are present in our field, and they have been for decades. So again, I'm Heather Geldart. I am the newest Deputy Director at Cal Recycle. I manage the debris operations for the state of California. But again, this is not about me. This is about our wonderful panelists that we have on the screen, of very, very diverse representation of the talent and the expertise that is present in our field. And I'll let the ladies introduce themselves. We'll start with Mary Ellen, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So I am the executive director for the Department of Emergency Management in San Francisco. Under my department, we have the 911 operations. We are all of the emergency services. So we run the EOC for the city. We are also the EMS administrator for the city. And our newest division is around street conditions. And so in San Francisco, we have played a large role and continue to in sort of a non-traditional crisis in emergency management, which is that of homelessness, the opioid crisis, and general street conditions here. And so I'm sure I'll have a little more opportunity to talk about that. I've been with the city and county almost 20 years, and I've had a number of different positions within a number of different departments doing emergency management and across the board. So I started in public health. I did a few years at a stint in the controller's office. So I did a lot of kind of financial recovery work. Spent 8 years as the security and emergency management director for our San Francisco Public Utilities, which is basically most of our infrastructure, water, power, and wastewater. And then about 5.5 years ago, was appointed the director by London Breed to run the Department of Emergency Management. And then in about a year later, all hell broke loose with the global pandemic. And it's pretty much been nonstop since then. I would say the pandemic, extreme weather, climate change, and our kind of more socioeconomic crisis have been the top 3 that have been on my plate for the last few years. I'm a mom, but I'm an empty nester. So I have a 22 and a 24-year-old, but I have been a working mother my whole life. And I'm a child of a nurse. So I was child of a single mom who was a nurse. So I really embrace and understand what it is to kind of do that and go through the ranks to become a leader in my field. And so looking forward to really diving more into the conversation. On the side, I'm a surfer, so I enjoy surfing and hiking, backpacking. I'm like an outdoorsy person, and that's what keeps me relatively sane in the world of crises. So I'll stop there, and thanks again.
That's great, Marilyn. And you really, really do highlight in your recent comments about the homelessness and the opioid crisis, how the evolution of crisis and how it finds its way to emergency management in general. It's not a straight direct path, and it's different for every jurisdiction and state. So, I'll be very curious to see the types of questions we get and how that evolution has come to your front doorstep and becoming your responsibility as an emergency manager. So I'm looking forward to the conversation as well. Carrie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. I please excuse my almost comically large headphones. These are the most comfortable ones that I own, and the quality's pretty good. So I apologize if they're kind of distracting. But with that, I am currently, my role is Director of Technology at Bent Ear Solutions. I have been involved at Bent Ear for about 1.5 years. And it's funny because I actually came into my current role and my current job through the All Hazards Consortium. I was involved with the All Hazards during my role at Duke Energy as a GIS analyst. And at Duke Energy, I was pretty involved in storm response, mostly because it was something that I had an intrinsic interest in. And so I kind of kept popping up on projects and asking to be involved, which eventually led me to get sent off to some hurricane response efforts, including Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Matthew. But I also got involved in the All Hazards Consortium, and that was one of the most pivotal opportunities of my career, in all honesty, because it exposed me to so many awesome people throughout the emergency management industry. So my current role interfaces with emergency management largely through the work that we do at Bent Ear is often about making people's lives easier who work in those spaces. mostly through geospatial technology solutions. But we also do other forms of consulting as well around business process. But my role at the company is really about supporting the project execution side of Ben Ear, as well as growing the program and really just trying to establish our place in the industry and kind of what our unique style is, which is one of the most joyful parts of my job. And I love what Mary Ellen said about her mom being an inspiration. I just have to mention that too. It made me, it sparked me to mention that, because my mom absolutely was an inspiration for me too. She was a single mom and was always very, very hardworking, but she always made it about making people smile at work. That was kind of her life's mission. And it definitely had a huge impact on me, because at the end of the day, I believe that if we're not centering the well-being of human beings, then we're not on the right path. So that's kind of my general philosophy on things. I think that's a pretty good overview. In my current role, I'm new to management. I will say that I'm new to leadership, and I have a lot to learn. One of the things that I've benefited so much from in my career is mentorship, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, during this discussion, but I highly recommend mentorship, either mentoring or being a mentee, to help move your career forward and just learn. But I currently at Ben Ear, I have 2 people that are directly underneath me, and one of them is our GIS manager, who also has direct reports, who are all the people that do all of the awesome things that make our company run. So those are all of our technology geniuses that, and they all inspire me every day. So very proud of that, very proud of them. And that's pretty much me. And as far as who I am outside of work, I am somebody who has a lot of different hobbies. I enjoy skating and rollerblading. I like crafting, crochet, all kinds of nerdy hobbies like that. And just kind of taking it easy, going on a hike and hanging out with friends. That's kind of how I like to live. So yeah, that's me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great points, Carrie. Yeah, I mean, I've always had the mantra, if it's not the work, it's the people. So I admire your mom's approach to the workforce and how you continue to carry that on for her and her legacy. So that's wonderful. Edie, would you please introduce yourself?
You're on mute, Edie.
Okay, sorry. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm Edie Casella, and I'm from Illinois, and my backdrop today is the State Emergency Operations Center. Though it's not activated, I thought you'd get an idea, have everyone have an idea of what the state of Illinois SCOC looks like. And this is where the state agencies, mutual aid groups, our private sector partners, virtually or physically, and also local and county jurisdictions come together during the time of an event to problem solve and come up with some good solutions for community resiliency. My background is in law enforcement. That was my first career. I retired 25 years ago, and it was a very interesting career. And it's kind of funny that you guys talked about your mothers. I was in college, I was working in a lab. I thought I was going to be a maid, like do grad work in the sciences. And my mom saw this article that said, look, they're hiring in the Chicago Tribune. They're hiring for the state police. and there's just like back then, that's a little unusual that, you would think your mother would be an advocate for that, but she was. So I blame her. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm very happy that she had me at least go into some kind of a public safety, government, giving back role in life. So, with the 25 years in law enforcement, the last 10 were in command and leadership roles. So that to me was probably, even though in the beginning, with the trooper, the investigator, and the ranks all the way as far as you want to go, those are all important. But I also think when you finally get to serve in these positions where you're making a difference, hopefully, with the people that you work with. That was some of the best times of my life. So after I retired, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I did some consulting with someone I had met up with from the Washington, D.C. area. And we worked on a project that he had acquired. And it was with fusion centers. And one of them happened to be the one in Illinois. And I served as a principal evaluator doing baseline assessments on how fusion centers operate, their operations and their framework, and from a baseline assessment perspective. And eventually, within a few years after that, all fusion centers now meet those requirements, not ours. I'm just saying it was a while before, after it started, that there was any baselines established. And we had an opportunity with a couple of states that wanted to do it independent of that time before it was required. So that kind of led me, because the state police connection, the fusion center connection, to the next role, which was building public-private partnerships. And I worked a little bit at the fusion center with their private sector group, and it's called Infrastructure Security Awareness. And I did some outreach on that, but then was tasked and asked to help in the emergency management environment with the Illinois Emergency Management Agency and the Illinois Terrorism Task Force. So that's where I began to do the public-private partnering side of what, I guess the responses from all the different roles that you can play in public safety. And so I've been in the field for 16 years, and it has really changed, as you can imagine, from how we started initially to where we're at today. And even though I have a Business Emergency Operations Center, BEOC, that functions as part of the SEOC, the partnerships themselves, that starts with the outreach, the marketing, and making the decisions of the companies, what that can and should play a role in this type of environment.
And that brings a good point that's connected to Carrie's kind of the Duke energy, the private sector moving forward, and how it's become such an integral part of how we respond to emergencies now, especially with the COVID pandemic as well. So.
Well, thank you. I'm just very, I love this job, and thank you for inviting me to talk about it.
Glad to have you, Edie. And last but not least, Ms. Sarah Evans.
Yes, hi, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you. So I am a career and leadership coach. I am headquartered right outside of our nation's capital. And I have been, I've had my own business after leaving Marriott. So I was with Marriott for a number of years. And after leaving, so when Marriott acquired the Starwood brand of hotels, there was a lot of change management that was needed. And I was brought on to reorganize teams and to lead succession management initiatives. And the one thing that really stood out for me is how lonely it can be at the top, how incredibly sort of overwhelming for some leaders, the head of the Caribbean and Latin America, the head of sales, right? To be saying, wow, nobody asks me what it is that would be helpful. Nobody has come to me and said, hey, can we build a tool that would work for you? And so when the pandemic hit, I left my job at Marriott. It was a hard decision, and I started my own business rather than downsizing teams, and decided I wanted to work with leaders and help them really get the support that they need to be the best leaders, right? And I love what all of you women have said, and that is what motivates you, what drives you, right? Like your why for doing this is really the key in my mind to pushing ourselves out of our comfort zones. We've all done it. I've done it. And I'm still doing it. And also I have to say it's fascinating because on this webinar that so many people are talking about their moms and their families and and adding the element of who we are as people, not just like robots, but we're really human beings. I have 2 teenage sons. I'm in a house full of boys, actually. I even have a male dog. But I have to say that being a woman, really, there's so many opportunities, and there's also so many ways that we have to support one another and to really champion our visions and our goals to move forward. So I'm happy to be here and to be part of this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you too, Sarah. Well, let's dive right in. Our introductions took a little bit. So we'll start with our first question that we've kind of set up for everyone to engage in the conversations. And we'll obviously be taking questions from the chat as they come across. But one of the questions we wanted to look at was, what are some of the challenges that, our panelists have had as women working in this industry? What did you learn along the way to help you navigate these obstacles within your profession and the personal advancement? And if you don't mind, Mary Ellen, because of your growth within San Francisco, I'd really like to have you start off the answering of this conversation. Oh, you're on mute, Mary Ellen.
Thank you. So I've been mostly in the field of security and emergency management most of my career, which, as we all know, has not been female dominated. It's certainly changing over time, but and occasionally there are advantages to that, but mostly it's challenging. So 2 things about this. One is just my own, I think, barriers that are somewhat of my own making, but something that we as women experience quite a bit, and which is that I generally, I think, set lower bars for myself, or maybe felt like I couldn't reach certain bars, or I wanted to be able to clear them completely, like catapult over before I was ready. And so I've often said that I have been helped by people who saw something in me that I did not see in myself. And it kind of took that sort of prodding to get to a level of leadership that once I arrived, I was able to see pretty clearly that I was right where I belonged. And that probably was a matter of being forced into a situation. I think the challenges can be when you're in that environment that you're not sort of automatically invited into the inside club, right? You don't have the access necessarily, the relationship. I believe, I mean, it's absolutely true that there is sort of like a boys' club that can be difficult to penetrate. And even respected colleagues, I have seen it happen even in San Francisco with colleagues that I really respect. And so we all have to, so what I think what I've taken from that is I try to have a consciousness about my privilege that I have seen in others, so that I am not sort of perpetuating that for other people, whether that's other women, other people of color, people who have a different background than me professionally, and all of that. So I think that has been the challenge at times, where you have to just work harder. You have to do creative facilitation sometimes to get in the room or in the conversation, but ultimately it's worth it. And we've got to push more people, women in particular, I think, push each other into these types of leadership positions. So I'll just share that I, of course, do whatever I can to mentor women. I try to recruit women into positions, and I would say well over 90% of the time convincing other women of their worth and of their value in a way that I generally don't have to with men.
Mary
They're like,
Ellen,
great, I'm in. With women, they're like, really? Me? Are you sure?
But I
Yeah,
think
you.
you hit on a
So-
great point though with
Yeah.
that, with the imposter syndrome. I think it's
Mhm.
something that everyone suffers from to an extent, but I think women suffer from it more, especially in a male dominated field. And I think allyship is a great way to help overcome that mentorship that you receive now that you extend further out. And even the comments that were put in here, I mean, it directly said allyship is a great way to leverage the privilege that you have in these roles and responsibilities to help fend off that imposter syndrome that we beat ourselves up with. It's every role, not just professionally, but even personally. We have imposter syndrome of the challenges and the roles that we take on with our children, with our friends and family. So, I mean, that's a great way to acknowledge it, but also try to address it as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Carrie, you're in a male-dominated field in the technology sector, at least it's rumored to be, but there has been quite an insurgence of women coming through, especially within the field of technology and emergency management. What are some of the obstacles that you've had professionally and personally? How did you overcome them and continue to advance within the field?
Yeah. So again, I'm going to have to say I'm piggybacking a little bit on some of the things that Mary Ellen mentioned, especially regarding some of the pressures that we have a tendency to place on ourselves as women in male-dominated spaces. Oftentimes, external expectations notwithstanding, we do have a tendency to either not expect that we'll reach, the bar that we're more than qualified for, as Mary Ellen mentioned, or we just expect very, very high performance out of ourselves in all domains of life. And sometimes we forget that energy and even willpower are finite resources, and we expect to be superstars in no matter what we do. And I think it's easy to forget that, and I'm speaking in generalizations and statistical norms, so this is obviously not true everywhere for every person, but women in particular are squeezed from more angles than our male counterparts in many ways. We still carry a lot of the mental burden at home. We still do most of the housework statistically, and we still do act as shock absorbers in society in many ways. And that's in addition to taking on actual, careers and full-time jobs over the last several decades. And that shift, I think, has been a challenging one. And I think all of that we tend to internalize and want to enter the workforce and enter these roles and really fix it all and do it all. And I am so guilty of this. And I have to remember that I think this is very common at the outset of careers too, when you haven't quite learned yet what your limits are. And I think a lot of people learn really quick what their limits are once you start trying to do your job that way. So some of the things that, and as I mentioned, I am new to leadership and I am in a learning phase of my life for sure. And some of the things that I have learned are educating myself on self-care and being able to recognize the signs of burnout. Women in the workplace are 32% more likely to experience burnout than men. And I think that speaks to not just the expectations in the workplace, but all of the other ways that we hold that burden in society. It weighs on you, it weighs on us. And we have to be mindful of that and take extra measures to take care of yourself and protect your time. And I think being able to recognize what's most important to you, family, what hobbies mean the most to you, what things matter the most to you in life, and being able to protect those things and protect your time is something that I'm still learning. And definitely looking to my colleagues on this panel for guidance on learning that. But that's, I think, very key to sustainable growth in your career without burnout and without having those ups and downs that I think many of us experience. I also am a ruminator. I'm guilty of overanalyzing and really contemplating the challenges and puzzles that I face in the workplace. And sometimes it's a fretful rumination, an anxious one, and sometimes it's not, right? But it still takes over a lot of hours of my day, not just the work time, but the thinking time. And something I've learned, and I think this also comes from that extra pressure to overperform, being able to set aside time for thinking We can't forget to do that. We have to set aside time to actually sit and think. And I like to do it at a coffee shop with a notebook and take it as a separate activity. But if we don't set aside time to think and put intentional energy towards those problems, I think they leak into our everyday life and we don't get a break from it. So those are a couple of the things that I've run into. These are not specific to women, obviously. Anyone in the workplace or anybody can struggle with these things, but I think that these are trends and patterns that women in particular struggle with. So I wanted to mention them.
Well, and I think you also hit on the point of not only do we want to be able to do it all, and we're typically demanded to do it all, but one of the things that I suffer with, it's a huge pride point for me to not ask for help or to not say that I'm at capacity. I like to show that I can do it all. And I think, when I came into the workforce, if you said no, or if you struggled, it was a weakness rather than being direct and saying like, no, I'm at capacity. I need to finish one before I take on another. And I think we're all starting to learn how to express that in a proactive and professional manner, as well as something where it's not viewed as a detriment to your progression or your career. This has been great. We're going to move on to the next question that we have. And I did see the question in the chat, and you actually Charlotte, you're hitting on our third question. So I'm just going to jump to that really quick. Charlotte had asked, how can we make it easier for folks to bring their full selves to the workplace? And the question we had kind of conformed over our development for this was, what types of tips for women leaders struggling to confidently advocate for themselves and communicate their value? And I think this is a good segue. It relates to Charlotte's question. And I'd really actually like to start with Edie on this, because coming from the law enforcement field and being in the command and having so many years of service, I'm sure that she's had to stand up for herself in quite a bit and communicate in a very professional manner, and dealing with private sector. I mean, it can get pretty hasty and hairy when you're making demands of different sectors. So Edie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how women can better bring their full selves to the workforce, as well as advocate for themselves. Oh, Edie, you're on mute.
I had my finger on there and then I take it off, and okay, thank you for your patience. I think the law enforcement time era, early 80s, there were very few women, and it just seemed that you didn't know what to expect. You didn't know who to trust, who was really going to be, if they wanted to mentor or be an advocate. It was just, and it was an unusual time. It's a paramilitary organization. I don't have any background in that. My dad was in the military, so I have some experience along those lines of hearing his background, his stories, whatever, but I've certainly never done that. But with the paramilitary side, it was a change in my life for sure. And it has changed it forever. I did want to just add a comment from the other question, that when I migrated, or when I transitioned to the emergency management environment, I really think it helped me that I had that experience in law enforcement. It seemed like I was more acceptable because they knew I had worked in that public sector safety arena. And I think I didn't feel like I had to prove myself as much. But I will tell you, on the other hand, with the the private sector and building these relationships, a lot of the people have very high titles, and in talking with them, I'm coming from leadership, but the leadership without authority, right? So I'm not dictating, ordering, and telling them what to do, but I'm trying to build a relationship that they would see the value in as well. And it doesn't mean that they haven't. The private sector has been really good about partnerships over the years in a lot of different sectors, but coming into the emergency management and homeland security environments, I think there is slowly but surely over the years, we're getting to be where we really want to be in terms of coming up with shared objectives of when we talk about response, or if we're doing a response during an event, it's at least coordinated, if not collaborated. And we learn to understand what each other's needs were. But for me, I guess I think back to the times and I understand how far we've come, that I don't think so much about what happened in my early days of law enforcement, because I probably would have decided not to stick with it. But since that time, it's a very diverse group. I feel very comfortable, and I do not feel that there is a lot of judgment going on. So I guess I come from a little bit of a different perspective. If I was strictly in law enforcement today, there's a lot of challenges to face. But back then, I just think it was so new and something that I had not been exposed to before, other than I wasn't even sure if I've ever even been stopped before. Okay, so I'm not sure I really understood all that until I got to be a part of it. And probably for me, the investigative side seemed to be the place where I fit best. I will tell you that they did want women in certain types of positions more, and gave you opportunities to do that if you were willing to, just because they felt that that might give that area an easier way to assimilate than necessarily other parts of law enforcement, where women have like a different approach, a softer approach sometimes when necessary, but very direct needed. And I had to learn to make those differentiations.
Yeah. Sarah, I feel like you have a lot that you could weigh in on this question. Some of the things that women can do to bring them their full selves to work, as well as confidently advocate for themselves and communicate their value. And then, I mean, even as well as pursuing the leadership role, how do we start to establish or set up ourselves as emerging leaders to pursue those leadership roles in a collaborative or in a cooperative way with our peers and those above us?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to being intentional. I really think that knowing your why, knowing your goals, knowing what you're good at and what motivates you is the first step. And then showing up for things like this, showing up for conversations where you are reminding yourself of what is important to you, reminding yourself that other people are going through them, right? Through the same sorts of things. So that's one thing, is that sort of being intentional about your goals, what you want, checking yourself regularly. Is what I'm doing in line with what I said I want? If I want to be here in 5 years, am I doing what I need to do to get there? So I think that's really a big one. And also focusing on really, once you know who you are and where you want to go, really focusing not just on telling your story, but on tangible examples of what you've done that shows you can, right? I think a lot of women that I work with feel, oh, maybe I'm not really as good at that, or could I do this? When I start asking them, well, give me examples. Oh, they have lots of examples. So I think sometimes we need to look at the actual examples. This is what I want. This is where I want to go. Let's look at the actual examples and let's tell people what we've done. Let's show them what we've actually done that demonstrated success in these areas. And I think that's a really impactful way to keep it top of mind and to really make sure that we're following that sort of true north where our values are and being intentional.
That ties right back to what Mary Ellen was talking about in the progression of her career and how you kind of have that imposter syndrome. And I will say, I don't know about you ladies or those in the chat, but it's not until I write down on my resume for either a new job application or a new board membership or whatever it may be, or pursuing your CEM, it's not until I sit down and have to recall and write it down that I actually remember the accomplishments that I've had or the contribution that I've made. And I think we have to be a little bit more deliberate in noting those and pushing those. So not only for others to see, but for yourself to see, because it's really easy to look past as what I'm doing is average when truly it's exceptional. And we just don't have the bird's eye view to realize how exceptional it truly is. So
that that makes me think, if I can, one more thing, and that is women are not taught to sell themselves. We are not taught that. We are taught to support others and to, not necessarily look good, although that some claim is part of it, but like look good more broadly, be presentable, have people, appreciate and enjoy that you're there. Women are not so good at selling themselves overwhelmingly. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. And I think we have to be very intentional as women that leaders who are successful are recognizing that they need to intentionally market themselves. This doesn't mean blowing yourself up. This means just letting people know what you bring to the table. So that was a really good, and being intentional with that.
Yeah.
So that people can see you for who you really are.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So some of the other questions we'd written out was saying no. Saying no is something women frequently struggle with, except me. It's my favorite word. I love saying it to my children. I love saying it to everybody. No, it's one of my favorite words, but it's a critical skill to being an effective leader. So what guidance, do you give women who find saying no to be a challenge? Carrie, you had talked about kind of your personal life management and self-care. How has saying no kind of helped you elevate into your career, or has it?
That's a great question. I think for me, this is something that I'm definitely still getting a grasp on. I'm definitely better than I used to be. But I think what really helps is to take the time to think about what situations would come up where you would say no. And part of that is learning yourself and your boundaries. I think a lot of the time, and I've definitely experienced this and been guilty of this, it's almost like our boundaries sometimes are based on somebody else's needs rather than our own. And learning our own boundaries helps us understand when you will need to say no, or when the opportunity to say no even arises. So it's almost like taking another step back and just establishing, whether that's your moral values and really taking the time to think on those, and occasionally refreshing them depending on, what's happened in your life, but just taking the time to think about it. But then also know what your needs are, as Heather mentioned, self-care. You might know that you need to have a certain night to yourself every night, and that's something that, you can't compromise on, because you know that if you do, X, Y, and Z will happen. Well, that's part of your core boundaries that you protect. And just knowing what those are, I think really, really helps. That way you can really say no with more confidence. You're saying no in a way that is informed of your own needs, rather than, saying no out of another reason, right? Or not saying it at all when you should have.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, how has the word no helped you in your career, or has it?
Oh, I'm really, really bad at it. Yeah, I mean, this is not a good question for me, to be honest with you. I guess the only way that I feel like I'm somewhat good about it is that I have learned to compartmentalize, and I definitely, I can check out sort of when I need to, but that's like very, I always have the phone with me. Like anyone could pull me out at any time. So, but at least, I'm able to know that. And in the role that I'm in, I'm on call 24/7. Like that just is not, like that will not end until I'm no longer in this position. That's just the nature of this particular job. So in order to survive, I can at least, go in the water, go on a hike, or, I play, another thing I do is play soccer, which is like the best thing ever, because you don't think about anything else but that. However, I really am working toward that. Here's what's driving me to learn to say no: my staff. Because as the leader, what I say yes to directly impacts them. And so that's what I'm working on. Because for the past 3 years, pretty much all of my staff, over 300 people, have been through, have kind of been through hell. And so as much as I may feel like I can take more on, which is debatable, I have realized that like my decisions impact them. And so that's kind of what I'm working on. And it's hard because I think there's some other questions that you have on here. Like, I think you have a question, not to like, spoiler alert, but like, what advice do I have for people who want leadership? Well, it's to say yes. So I think as women, we have this issue. Like, I feel like I have been very focused on saying yes, both for myself for leadership and also pushing other women to say yes. But I'm learning a little bit about like discernment, essentially, and the no. But I'm really just terrible at it. I'm like level 1 in recovery from saying yes to everything.
We'll work together on it. I
Okay,
think because
good.
you're out of practice, probably because I have toddlers and I say no about 100 times a day.
Yeah.
But there is a great question that Sarah McDonald posed to you in particular, saying, do you feel that being in the public sector makes saying no more difficult? Do you feel that in the public sector saying no limits your growth potential and options?
Absolutely. I mean, the leadership role that I have right now for San Francisco is one that impacts very serious crises that are affecting the city and affecting people and are really life and death. And so it is extremely challenging to pick out and say like, no, we're not going to do this. No, and yet, I think where I'm getting to is it is creating in myself a different kind of leadership personality, I guess, which is like, I'll say yes, but everyone else has to also, you know what I mean? Or if we can't get the resources we need, then it's a no across the board, right? So, my job really is I'm like a convener. I bring people together. We're like the problem solvers, but I have to have a lot of people, following my direction who don't report to me.
Yeah.
And that is super challenging. Those people know how to say no. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, I have for me, public service is like, I was going to say like religion. I don't think that's the right thing, but it's first in mind for me all the time. I know who I work for. It is the people of San Francisco.
Yeah.
So it makes it a little bit different.
So for a perspective that's not public sector, Edie, please, do you want to chime in?
Well, I was just going to tag on to what Mary Ellen said. I'm sort of in that same position, but maybe not with the constituency as much as the private sector people who I don't have, direct authority over. So you're trying to talk to them in a different manner. Very empathetic listening, I think, goes a long way compared to maybe when I was in uniform or something, you just approach things differently. But the other comment, so I would agree with Mary Ellen to a certain extent on that, who your audience is. Sometimes it requires you to kind of have that change of yes or no. The other thing, Heather, I would ask you to look at this. When you said this about the no thing, I started thinking about the one that starts with a K, right? So the no, you can't do everything yourself.
I do know all.
And then if you learn to include others or delegate, your no could mean an opportunity of yes for somebody else. So I tried to think of that in a positive way, but I didn't, I thought of no and then no. So
yeah. Well, Sarah, for someone who's not in the public sector, who doesn't deal with life or death situations directly, how do you feel about the word of no in career progression?
There's two choices, yes and no. Right. So when you're not saying no to something, you're saying yes. And in saying yes to something, you're saying no to something else. So think about that for a second, right? Like back to intentionality again, right? No what KNOW, know, kind of, you want to know what you're about. What do you stand for? What are your goals? What gets you up in the morning? What gives you a feeling of pride, even when you have a day that's crushing? Okay. So if you're not saying no, you're saying yes. And you're saying no to something else. There aren't unlimited doors and opportunities. So I thought that, Edie, was really interesting what you just said, because think about how, you know, your actions also, there could be a way to think about things that's a little bit different. You may be saying yes to something because you're sort of hesitant to say no. You want to be an open-minded yes person. You want to show that you can do it, but how is that going to impact others?
Yeah.
It may be that the best thing you can do as a leader is to really stand up for your people, and in different ways, shapes, and forms, right? And so it may be that saying no really is the best possible thing you can do. You have to really be intentional.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's very hard.
So we have some great questions in the chat. Milena, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. How do we know that we are successful as leaders, and when to step back? When is being good enough okay? And when is success enough? And I will, just from a personal preference, you know, I just accepted this job with CalRecycle. And as I was leaving my life in Virginia, I really questioned myself in how my aspirations, my professional desires is impacting my family, and why couldn't I be satisfied with where I was at? I wasn't living a bad life. I loved my job. I loved my community. My family had a good life, but yet I still aspired for more. And I really do. I think, I don't know if that struggle ever goes away, but I do defer to some of the women on our panel and our leadership here. You know, how do you know when being good enough is okay and when success is enough? Edie, for having a 2-career stint of over 40 years, I think you should weigh in here.
Well, it's funny you say that, and I'm going to approach it a little differently, not to avoid the direct question, but I want to approach it a little differently. I think for me, I'm thinking, you know, sometimes I relate to songs, right? And this one's dating us back here with Peter, Paul, and Mary, but it's sort of like the day is done. So when you go home at night, for me, it can be a personal crisis and consequence, because I'm like thinking, I'm one of those people, like Mary Ellen said, I want to do this 24 hours. I know you can't. You love it. I probably don't have the same type of lifestyle you do. I don't have children or immediate family, but you tend to get wrapped up in these issues, especially when there is so much of a crisis where you want to help people and you want to do the right thing. So when the day is done and I go home, or at the end of the day is other things that people call it, I do take a look at sometimes I start at just that day or the 3 days we just worked on a huge storm. But I will tell you now, and this is the really personal side to this, which is, when do you know if you've really accomplished what you want to accomplish in life, and how do you judge that? Because in my mind, I'm at that crossroads right now of, is my day done in terms of a second retirement or moving on to something else? So Heather, I know I approached it a little differently, but I do a lot of internalizing even in the evening. So I don't wait for it all to catch up and think of ways to start the next day with a better approach. But as I said, as I'm looking at the end of this career, where I should be, that's kind of like the permanent day is done for me. And I want to give other people an opportunity to do the same thing I'm doing, just because it's just so meaningful. But it's like letting go, and that's hard.
Yeah,
I'm sure Sarah has some comments on letting go.
Carrie, as a new leader, what drove you to strive after this position from where you were, and what do you continue to strive for within your technical growth and leadership growth?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think for me, a few things sort of drove me in this direction. to, step into a director role. One of those was a personal propensity for thinking at things or thinking about things in a certain way. I've always been an abstract thinker, and someone who works well at the strategic level. Not that I'm not also able to get down to details, but I find that as I progressed throughout my career, that I kept gravitating towards wanting to work on programs rather than projects. And so when I realized that and the opportunity presented itself, I knew that I was early, and I knew that ideally I would like to have more experience in a managerial type of role before taking on a director role. But I knew that it was an opportunity to learn, and I felt that I could do it. That was the other thing that, so kind of speaking to some of the wise people in my life who have said really helpful things. One really helpful thing that a good friend of mine said way back before I took this position, I was talking about the possibility of it, and I was telling him, I said, I don't think I'm ready, I just don't know. And he said, well, do you think you could do it? Like, do you think you're able to, And I said, yes, I think, I'm capable, right? Like, I have the ability to do it. I just think I'm not ready, or, And he said, well, then that's probably the role that you want to be in, is the one that is challenging you and pushing you, that you're capable of. So you're not beyond your ability, but you're being challenged and you're being pushed. And that completely changed my perspective on making the decision to say yes to a pretty significant change in my career that involved a lot more responsibility, which has definitely been a learning curve. But at the end of the day, I think, and I've almost lost track of the original question, to be honest with you, but making the decision to go into leadership, I think it's very individual. And I think it also depends on, whether you're, better at, if your interest in leadership is something that comes from an intrinsic source that drives you, that's aligned with your values, that you find is pushing you, then that's almost never a bad decision. Because if your cause is true and you have an open mind and you're always learning, you're almost always going to make things better if you have that perspective. So I hope that that's a good answer to your question. I'm sorry, I kind of forgot the original question.
No, it's all good answers. And Edie, like, even when you said, I'm thinking about this differently, it's got to be holistic. We have to look at it from every perspective. So I appreciate every contribution that's said. Mary Ellen, would you like to contribute to this one?
Yeah, I think that what's going through my mind a little bit as we have this discussion is that, the work that we all do is worthwhile. We are managing crises in order to mitigate harm. We're responding in order to help people. But what has happened for me is that I have really grown in my confidence in my role and what I'm doing. I trust my instincts at work for the most part. I feel comfortable coming as myself. Like, people really know who I am. Like, I talked about like being in therapy and like all the things that I did during COVID to like keep it together. But I was really getting super burnt out, I think. I don't know, for lack of another thing. Like, it just was like, and I've tried to like change my mindset around a little bit from, instead of like, oh, this is so hard and why am I doing this, to how do I thrive in this position? Like, how do I thrive in this job? What would it take? And if there is no thriving, then I'm not in the right place. Like, then it may be time to step down and give folks another chance. And, so for me, what that means is like, next week, I'm taking a road trip. I'm going to Joshua Tree and Malibu. Like, I'm getting out of here, I'll still have my work phone with me.
Can never
But,
leave it.
there are things that I have to do to do that. And it's interesting because I'm reaching like a 20-year mark working for the city. I'm 54 years old, so I'm like relatively young-ish, right, as far as a career goes. But I will have to make a decision, in a few years. Like, is this something that I want to continue to do for the next decade or not? And so it is something that I think everybody should be doing all the time, like whether you're at the beginning or middle of your career, is where is your head and your mind and your body, and like, are you right there? Are you okay with it? And I will be honest, like, I really struggled hard. As the hardest thing about my career has been being a mom and working.
Mhm.
And my kids are now 22 and 24, so they're like, it's easier and they don't live with me anymore. But that is still with me, that balance that I constantly, felt like I was not doing well all the time. And so if anything, I think, I really want to fight for women not to have to feel that, because
Yeah.
we need women working in leadership. Like, the world, the planet needs us. So how do we allow women who want to be mothers, or human beings, right, who want to be mothers, to have the space and the support and the mental health and all of that to do it? So I don't know. I'm not sure I answered the question, but these are the things that are coming to me right now. And I think it ties back to like our own, taking care of ourselves. And it ties back, Harriet, I think is what you were saying a little bit too, about how, like, or I can't remember who said it, but, we do everything. We're under such pressure to be perfect in all the things. And so that takes a toll. And so how do we mitigate that harm? Right? How do we reduce that risk to ourselves? And I said there was a question about taking risks and all that kind of stuff. But I think that that is what I'm very interested in. And I also try to work with the women and people who work with me, and not only just women, but men too, that have families, and have a balance in life, because work is important, and brilliant, effective, dedicated, servants to the public and to work come in all different, genders and backgrounds and circumstances. And how do we make it so that they can do their work, thrive at work, but also thrive as a human being on the planet?
No, great points. Absolutely. Absolutely. And since you kind of went towards the next question with Kanata posed, was talking about years ago, INC Inc. published a scientific study that touched on feminine and masculine risk-taking and how female risk-taking is overlooked. Have any of you dealt with this positively, negatively? Still seeing this? I see this daily in my small business position. And how do you make your way through it? Sarah, I would like to hear kind of how you, from your perspective in coaching and mentorship, how you look at risk-taking. And do you see differences between feminine and masculine risk-taking, or men and women in their approaches, and are they received differently?
So I have honestly worked, as I work more with men, it's just fascinating. I've noticed that a lot of the things that we say, they say to themselves too, but that it exhibits differently. Sort of the social, what's acceptable is a little different. In terms of risk taking, I think that women in general have a lot of, how do I say, it's like guilt about, is it like, this excites me, I want to do this. And instead of seeing it as it's for the betterment of my career and it will, it's a worthwhile thing, it's sort of, but if I do that, I might fail at it, or if I do that, I might negatively impact others, or so I'm just going to wait, right? Like we said in the beginning, for somebody to tap me and to tell me, I'd like you to step up and be a leader. Like, I think women do wait. That's what I'm seeing, is a lot of women are not charging ahead and saying, pick me, I'm ready. They're waiting for somebody because that's what we were taught to do.
Well,
I mean, we're in many ways, at least a lot of women I work with, that is what they were told. You know, I had a teacher in 5th grade who told me, women don't need, I wanted to be in the top math group. Women don't need to be good at math. Women can be good at English and social studies.
Wow.
My mother didn't like that at all, and she marched in there, but I didn't need her permission, right? But
Yeah.
that sense of, I need someone's permission. I shouldn't be pushing for myself.
Well, I think not only that, I think we're actively discouraged a lot of times. They're using descriptive terms such as aggressive instead of persistent.
That's right.
They, you know,
That's
and I
right.
think-
In other words, yes.
Yeah, I think that when we talked about the allyship earlier, and when Laura was talking about some of the men on the webinar, I think it's really important that those adjectives are changed, because they are detrimental to your career when you describe a woman as aggressive instead of persistent or an expert. It is the perception of them changes, and I extend it to Edie. How do you feel that there's a perception of the male versus female risk taking or type of drive within the field? Have you seen that in your career, and how did you mitigate it or deal with it? You're on mute, Edie.
I thought you were done asking me questions. I think I said this before, but I think I experienced some of these things more from a negative standpoint in law enforcement because of the years ago. I think now there's so much more awareness and mandated training at state and federal levels, and there's an awareness, and I do think there are changes, taking place. But I was also thinking that, can you be creative and assertive at the same time, and do women feel that way when they're coming into with their team to talk about solving problems? Do they feel comfortable coming to the table and taking a stance, not like you said, in an aggressive manner, and certainly not in a passive manner, but maybe in a more, passionate? And you know what I mean by that is, your strengths, your weaknesses, and so how you discuss these things at the table with your peers, or your superiors, or your subordinates, those are all, I think, noticeable. The one thing I think still it is a concern for me is I do think there is always more notice in a woman's tone of voice than a man's. And I do feel that I am someone probably who has that fluctuating tone or whatever. And I always am concerned that people are reading it the wrong way. I mean, for people who know me, that's pretty much how I am. But when they're new to you, it can be a turnoff, or there's a concern that they've done something, or it is, just a misinterpretation. And I don't see that so much in when you are having these conversations from a man's perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily, picking that out as it's something that I still notice from, before.
Mary Ellen, you're off mute. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say for the record that it is a lot easier to get what you want and need and to make change the higher you go in a leadership position. And so and again, this has been sort of my mindset, as like that my challenges have grown, but my influence has grown. My ability to affect change has grown. My ability to help other women is directly related to where I sit, which is a position of power within the city of San Francisco and this administration. Now, that may not last forever, but as long as I'm here, and that is motivation, right? If you can think about it that way, if you're a person who, wants to make those changes and sees things that you want to kind of forget, not only for yourself, but I think for all women, of course, not every woman thinks this way, but I'd like to think that those of us that are on this call today, and many of us, understand that we have a lot of, we've got a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of people to pull up with us. And boy, is it easier to do when you're here than
Absolutely.
when you're not.
Absolutely. Sarah.
Yeah, and Mary Ellen, along those lines, you are helping other women see that they can do what you like. It becomes more socially acceptable. It becomes more feminine. It becomes more normalized. It becomes, and also to men as well. And I think it's when we think about what we can do to promote more women, we promote ourselves and we show women that it is normal, that you can be a fulfilled woman and also be in a position of power and leadership, and strength in your career. And I think that's something that we don't often focus on. But it is, the more you see it, the more it becomes acceptable. And the more young girls that will aspire to that as a goal. I mean, let's think about what my mother was told: you could be a teacher or you could be a nurse. And things, the messages we share with our children, with their children, with our neighbors' children, within our community is by our own actions. And I think that's really important.
We have a great question in the chat that I'm sure is a sensitive subject, but I think it's necessary to kind of address. Sarah McDonald talks about, do you feel that your superiors or coworkers challenge your commitment to your job if you choose to have a family more than some of the male coworkers with families? How do you get around those doubts? So essentially she's asking, and Sarah, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but do people challenge your commitment to your 24/7 public safety career because you chose to have children and your obligations to them versus a male's choice to have a family? Mary Ellen, you openly shared how you are a single mother. I would love to hear your perspective in that, especially because you have grown ones and you're now at the top of your career.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a difference. And it depends on each family composition is a little bit different. I support the fathers in my team, on my team, as much as the moms. I also have an understanding of kind of who carries more of the load. And that's none of my business, but you kind of try to support people in the circumstances that they're in. I will also say that for people that do not have children or who are single or whatever, and I see them never taking time off, I take them aside and be like, you gotta get a hobby or something, because like this isn't good for you either.
Join your soccer team.
Yeah, something like that. So absolutely. I mean, I think that someone in the chat said, as the field becomes more diverse, we'll get better at it, you said speaking styles and ways of working, but just in general. I will say, I had this conversation with a bunch of, and I'll just say kind of older white men who we were talking about, hybrid work conditions, right? So not being in the office all the time. And there was a lot of like, well, back in the day, like they didn't like it because they're like, how you knew how I got ahead was like being the first one in and the last one out and always there. And I was just like, whoa, like that is not okay. Like that cannot be the measure by which we are seeing who is productive and who's leaders and everything. And this was a conversation I had like very recently. So there's still work to do, that hybrid work. I mean, it can be challenging, but I also think that ultimately it's really good for people, for humans, to live their lives.
Well, and it's interesting, Mary Ellen, to me, you're talking about the generational divide, right?
Yeah.
The way my parents were in their work environment versus me versus the next generation coming up. I think especially COVID had launched us into this necessary evolution to create a better work-life balance and to show that, your merit comes on productivity rather than presence all the time. And I think that that's important. But there's still a lot of traditional view. And unfortunately, a lot of those traditional views are held by people in power and people in leadership positions. So how do we as just women or just younger emerging leaders come through and demonstrate that level of value without violating our own work-life balance or violating our own principles? I mean, I would love to hear the panel's thoughts. Carrie, how do you work with it?
Well, I'd like to kind of call on something that Mary Ellen said earlier. This is just how it's going today. I love it. But I just love everything Mary Ellen says. But we need women, and I think the thing that some people forget is that diversity of thought, diversity of experience, of perspective is not fluff. It's not just to be PC. It's not, some frou-frou thing that we do just to be nice people. It's something that is necessary. It's a requirement for us as a society to even have a shot at solving the complex problems that we face. We forget how existentially complex they are. And in order to have that shot, we need everybody's perspective at the table. We need open minds, we need different backgrounds, different ideas, and we need women at the table. And remembering that, the workplace as it is today, less so than before, but still as it stands, was created by men for men to work in. It was not created for women. It was created for men, because women until World War II really did not occupy meaningful space in the workplace. And we still have not fully, we've included women. Women are allowed to apply to jobs. They're included, but we can't just stop at inclusivity. We have to go another step, and we have to get women at the table as far as creating something new and actually fixing the problems that we have. And that's women, that's people of color. As we've said, people of various diverse backgrounds are needed at that table, period. It's not any political agenda, it's just reality. And I think just remembering that value is something that all of us bring. Every single person on this call brings that perspective that's different to the table, and it's incredibly important. So when it comes to advocating for your value, just remember that first and foremost, that we are needed at the table, and the things that some have written off as weaknesses, things like empathy, compassion, and showing emotion, are not weaknesses. In fact, they are strengths. At least that's what I believe. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, it does. I loved it. I loved
Keep
it.
in
Edie, you're off mute. Do you want to contribute? I gotcha.
It's hard for, I know you did bring in, the different lifestyles people that have, and I appreciate Mary Ellen saying, I have to pull those people aside that they haven't taken a vacation. And, okay, that's something I'm taking to heart here. No, but I just, this is one thing I found about mentorships, not necessarily sponsorships, but mentorship. I am surprised sometimes, and I noticed this in my law enforcement more because it was you were being competitive, right? To go up the ranks, to improve yourself, to have opportunities for other jobs. Sometimes when you thought all you had was yourself to be your advocate, you were wrong. I mean, and I know that now. There were people who you might have worked with on a crime scene, and then later on they come back to say, hey, did you put in for that job? I heard that job's open. And just so you know, if you're interested, I'll write a letter of support. Or, hey, someone reaches out, a colonel or something, would you like to come and work on over this command or something? Then I find out it was a recommendation of someone who I had worked with over time. So I don't want to leave that part out about the having a mentor, which, or being a mentor. So there's that part where you may not know who's really mentoring for you. And I think that I just, think that's important. And I think it's also important that you can, and Carrie touched on this, about making sure you're doing your part on mentoring. And I will tell you this, when we've been talking about the backgrounds where there was more men in the position to begin with or whatever. If you look at public-private partnering, particularly from the emergency management side, most of the people I interact, there are some men who are running these programs, but the majority are women. And I find that interesting. And I would like maybe any of your thoughts on why you think women might migrate to a position like that to run it. And the only reason why I say that is because I've been in the field so long in public-private partnering, I do get a lot of inquiries from people who are just trying to get a program off the ground. And that's quite a few of them being women. So I'm not asking the questions, Heather, but I'd just be interested if someone had some thoughts on why they think maybe that's the case.
I think that's a great question, Edie. Anybody from the panel want to chime in? I mean, I know for myself, I would see it working with public-private partnerships and knowing that it's maybe because there's less ownership and more collaboration and cooperation that are necessary. And, I think it's more of an indirect negotiation a lot of times with the private sector. You can't force them to do it. Sometimes you can't pay them to do it. So I maybe that's part of it. Carrie, what would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think too, women, and I hope I don't butcher this by saying that I believe are some studies that have shown that women tend to have an easier time holding complex ideas and a lot of nuance and looking at things from a lot of different angles. And that could be how we are culturally nurtured growing up, or it could be a mix of some genetic components. But either way, perhaps it could be sort of that propensity to look at things from the big picture, see different angles, sit in the nuance and in the complexity of the situation, and recognize that there is missing connective tissue. That's not necessarily a cut and dry policy or outcome. It's something that's a little bit more tricky and complex. And so maybe as women, maybe we are more apt and more just drawn to those kinds of problems because we tend to be well positioned to see them also often as outsiders. If you're an outsider to any group, no matter what the group is and no matter what you are, you're going to be more likely to see the forest for the trees because you're not as in it in the in-group. So those are just my thoughts.
No, that's great. All right, well, we have just a few more minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the horn and ask you all to give a last piece of advice, tip, or tactic that we can give to our audience today. Either on leadership, on advocacy, on allyship, however you guys feel that is most valued from the conversation today, please. And we will start with Edie.
Well, I think I already brought that to everyone's attention when I talked about the day is done. It's not just the everyday thing, but it really is what you've accomplished and what did you get what you wanted in your career. It's not just what other people recognize, but is that self-recognition. And if you're satisfied, maybe it's time to let go. So I've already talked about that from the song side of A Day's Done, but that would be my final.
That's wonderful, Edie. Sarah, would you like to contribute your tip, trick, or advice?
Yeah, I would say, be strategic. Really get to a high level, get out of the details and up into the high level strategy of who you are and where you want to go. And then be intentional about getting there.
I really appreciate the intentionality suggested. I think that's great. Mary Ellen.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I guess I would add, is to really think about how you think about things. Where is your mind? And ask yourself, how this is sort of this road I'm on right now, how do I be here now and thrive where I am? If in fact, this is where I want to be able to affect this change. Because I think where I was going down, I'll just be honest, it was a different road, which is like, this is killing me. I'm not going to make it. Like, to be honest, like, I don't know how long I can do this. And when I changed my mindset, it also changed my actions. And I'm in a much better place. Like, I can do this, you know? So I think it's all of these things, but I think we also have to know ourselves, like know yourself. And so I hope that many of the folks that are listening and many women out there know themselves, know how badass they are, and that they can go for it. But I want you to also know how to take care of yourself. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Carrie.
Yeah, I would say something that I try to echo in my mind quite often is not letting perfection get in the way of progress. I really struggle with this. And an example of this in my life recently, I have been buying books for several years with every genuine intention of reading them. And just with everything with the job, and I really struggle to focus to read books. And so finally I said, you know what? I'm going to listen to audiobooks, and that's okay. And I'm not going to feel shameful about it. I'm still getting the information. And you know what? It's fine. And it's important that we remember that just because it's not perfect doesn't mean it's not progress, and to just keep moving forward. So that's all I've got.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Really appreciate everyone's contribution today. Thank you for letting me be a part of the discussion and help facilitate the questions from the chat. Great questions from our audience. Sincerely appreciate your contribution, and just thank you in general. Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Same here. Thanks to our panelists for your words of encouragement, your advice, and your support. And I encourage everyone on the line to get involved with the All Hazards Consortium efforts in this area. So what we'll do from here is we did record today's session. So give us a day or two to massage it a little bit, and then we will email everyone the recording. And that will include my contact information and information on the additional webinars that we're putting together for you now. And when you get that, I would love any feedback that you have on today or things that you'd like to see in the future that would help you grow in your own career as a woman in crisis and consequence management. So thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, informative, inspirational. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.